Alicization Lycoris is very much the sum of its parts. It uses a mix of mechanics that worked for Hollow Fragment and more so Hollow Realization. And while I do think that AL has a fun and rewarding combat system, I feel it dropped the ball in a few key areas. So to understand where it went wrong, I want to look at bits and pieces of Hollow Fragment and Hollow Realization. So let's start with basic attacking. Starting with HF, specifically using the Vita version, the main thing AL takes from this is the risk meter. Its purpose is pretty straightforward. The higher the risk, the more damage you do and take. In AL, that's its only real job. In HF, however, it is tied deeply to the core combat loop of the game. So then, HF has three types of attacks: auto, burst, and sword skills. Auto attacks are used to mainly build back up SP. They're effectively useless otherwise. Burst attacks are quick attacks that draw aggro and do a small amount of damage and are good to use when you're out of SP. And sword skills, like always, are your bread and butter. I want to focus on the burst attacks mainly. Burst attacks are tied to your burst gauge, a yellow bar with 5 columns. Every time you use a burst attack, you consume 1 gauge. The previously mentioned risk meter is tied directly to this. The higher the risk, the slower this gauge refills, meaning less burst attacks. And you don't want this to happen when you're low on SP. So then what do? In AL, the only way to get this risk to drop is to simply stop attacking, and that's not the case here. You need to use the switch mechanic. Not only does this drop risk to 0 instantly, your partner character is now the source of whatever that aggro you had was, meaning the burst attack goes back up, and you're free to use more of the options you have available to you. With that said, let's move on to Hollow Realization. HR's main combat is done through Sword Skill Connect, or SSC. Auto attacks have been replaced with a manual swing of your sword at every press of the left face button. But what makes HR truly shine is how it handles its battle palette. In this palette, you can set more than 16 shortcuts for attacks and skills. 4 tied to the top face button, you have a neutral input, directional and face button input, double tap and same input, and spinning the stick and then the input. All of that applies to the right face button as well. When holding the left bumper, you get 4 more on the D-pad and another 4 on the face buttons. And on top of that, you can open a full 10x6 palette that you can put whatever you want in and open at any time, including during combat. That amount of customization is why so many people love Hollow Realization. It's ridiculous, and I love it. That said, HR uses the palette you set for combat. Upon use of a sword skill, there will be a distinct flash during this animation. If you do the input required for another set sword skill on this flash, you will perform the SSC. Not only does this cut the ending animation of the previous skill, it adds 10% of damage to every single successful SSC. By late game, you can have an SSC of 33, and the game expects you to do at least an SSC of 5 consistently by the end. So how does AL stack up? Well, as I already said, the risk meter is pretty shallow in AL, so how about the Sword Skill Connect? Alicization Lycoris allows you to set 5 sword skills at any time, which is pretty small compared to HR. But the biggest change is that you can only have an SSC of 3, and there is no damage multiplier. That said, I want to back up a little bit as I need to mention something. In all 3 games, the use of a sword skill, as you might have guessed, consumes SP. In Hollow Fragment, you have a total of 300 SP the entire game, and a sword skill only cost 50. Hollow Realization lets you increase that number to an absurd degree, allowing well over 1000 SP, but any normal sword skill still only costs 50 to 80 SP, with ultimates costing around 150 to 300 in each game. Alicization Lycoris, like Hollow Fragment, only has 300, but every skill costs 100 SP. You can see the problem, right? I haven't talked about battle skills yet at all, but they cost SP too. So what do? In HF and HR, you can get SP back in big chunks in a couple of different ways, but the main two are to perfect dodge and parry attacks. This allows you to keep the flow of combat going by reacting to enemy attacks, dodging or countering, and then go back on the offensive. Holo-realization takes it a step further again. If you have a skill fusion of level 4 or higher, you can cancel any animation with a parry. Any animation. If you're successful, you don't break your sword skill connect, and you just stunned the enemy and got back a ton of SP. Not to mention, you can also dodge during an SSC without breaking it either. The punishment for failing is obvious though. You break your chain, you lose SP, and the damage multiplier. What makes this combat system feel so rewarding is that every single mechanic works towards keeping that said combat flowing. While you're constantly using SP, every action you can take during battle works towards restoring it without stopping battle. Alicization Lycoris does allow you to refill your SP this way, but only through the use of set skills as passives. I see this as a problem because the previous two games had it as part of the core system, and you can only have 4 passives set at a time, which in itself is a problem. What AL normally does reward a parry or dodge with is filling the arts gauge, which allows you to use a few different things when it's full. A glorified super move, a team attack, or super arts, which allows you to use sword skills for free until the gauge empties back out. But without that SSC damage multiplier, you're still not doing as much damage as it feels like you should be. So now what? Enter the Synchroniser. The Synchroniser is a damage multiplier separate from the SSC. It activates by landing sword skills at the same time as your allies and can also be stacked in AL up to 3 times, 4 with the battle skill. The problem is though that AL wants to be HR without giving you all of the options that Holo-realization had. In HR, the Synchroniser and the SSC worked together. That's how major damage is done. But the Synchroniser by itself just isn't enough, and you will feel it in Alicization Lycoris. The long story short is that Alicization's combat is still very fun, even with all of the flaws that it does still have. And I do believe, much like HR, it'll probably get more added to it at a later date with the constant updates the game has coming its way. But if you have played the Holo games, you will feel a bit naked when it comes to combat. And I didn't even go into how the previous games had properties for every sword skill, or even Lycoris's EX sword skill connect, which honestly has its own set of problems. But I feel like that's all I want to say on the matter at this right exact moment. So as always, guys, keep it real, keep it weird, and stay excellent.